After President Trump pardoned nearly 1,600 January 6 insurrectionists, including more than 600 charged with assaulting or impeding law enforcement, the Department of Justice is arguing in court that these pardons provide immunity for wholly unrelated crimes in multiple cases. Jared Weiss was filmed on January 6, encouraging his fellow rioters to attack the Metropolitan Police Department officers. Thanks, Chairman Grassley, for holding this oversight hearing. Welcome, Attorney General Bondi. I'm glad that we are following this committee's long-standing tradition of regular oversight hearings with the Attorney General, the Director of the FBI, and the Secretary of Homeland Security. These hearings have never been more important as President Trump turns the full force of the federal government on Chicago and other American cities. The assault on the city I am proud to represent is just one example of how President Trump and Attorney General Bondi shut down justice at the Department of Justice even before the President's party, controlling the White House, Senate, and House of Representatives, shut down the government. The Attorney General has systematically weaponized our nation's leading law enforcement agency to protect President Trump and his allies and attack his opponents and, sadly, the American people. You have purged hundreds of senior career officials since you first appeared before us. These men and women had dedicated their careers to protecting the American people. As a result, the department has lost literally thousands of years of law enforcement expertise. To be specific, you disbanded the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force and the National Cryptocurrency Enforcement Team, despite the growing threat of foreign election interference and the drastic rise in cryptocurrency crimes. You forced out almost 75% of the Civil Rights Division's career attorneys, while hate crimes are on the rise. You fired more than 100 immigration judges, while the immigration case backlog is more than 3 million. You cut the public integrity section from 30 prosecutors to 2, while political corruption skyrockets. During your confirmation hearing, I asked you about your many potential conflicts of interest as a former lobbyist. You responded under oath, quote, "You will consult with career ethics officials within the department and make the appropriate decision," end of quote. But the Justice Department then removed those career ethics officials and put in their place inexperienced political appointees beholden to President and you. And you've effectively shut down the Office of Professional Responsibility, which investigates misconduct by Department of Justice attorneys. Now, with these ethical guardrails out of the way, corruption has run rampant at the Department of Justice. Although you've been a registered foreign agent for Qatar, you did not recuse yourself from signing off on President Trump's solicitation of a free jet from the royal family, even though this gift was clearly illegal. Connections to Attorney General Bondi seem to yield more favorable outcomes for defendants. At least 2 long-running federal prosecutions were abruptly dropped after the defendants hired your brother. It's no surprise that Ed Morton, the failed U.S. attorney nominee you appointed as senior official, said, quote, "No MAGA left behind." Our nation's top law enforcement agency has become a shield for the president and his political allies when they engage in misconduct. Last year, President Trump's border czar, Tom Homan, was allegedly recorded accepting a $50,000 bag of cash in exchange for promising immigration enforcement-related contracts. Under your leadership, the investigation into Mr. Homan was dropped. After President Trump pardoned nearly 1,600 January 6 insurrectionists, including more than 600 charged with assaulting or impeding law enforcement, the Department of Justice is arguing in court that these pardons provide immunity for wholly unrelated crimes in multiple cases. Jared Weiss was filmed on January 6th, encouraging his fellow rioters to attack the Metropolitan Police Department officers. And he said, "F them, kill them." What happened to Mr. Weiss? He's been hired by you as a senior advisor. In February, you said the Epstein client list was, quote, "sitting on my desk right now for review." 8 months later, you still haven't produced these files, and a credible whistleblower told my office that FBI agents were directed to flag any records in which President Trump was mentioned. The Department of Justice ordered the dismissal of corruption charges against the former New York City Mayor Eric Adams in a corrupt backroom deal to secure his cooperation with the president's immigration agenda. Acting U.S. Attorney Daniel Sassoon, a Republican appointed by President Trump, resigned in protest. Acting U.S. Attorney for the Eastern District of Virginia, Eric Siebert, a Republican appointed by President Trump, was forced to resign because he didn't believe there was sufficient evidence to indict New York Attorney General Letitia Adams or former FBI Director James Comey. In his place, President Trump installed his former personal attorney, someone with no prosecutorial experience, to indict Director Comey, which she did. She joins a network of unqualified MAGA loyalists masquerading as federal prosecutors, like Alina Habba, who said she would use her position to, quote, turn New Jersey red, close quote, and Sigal Chattah, who once said that a black political opponent was, quote, should be hanging from an effing crane, end of quote. The President and Attorney General attempted to bypass the Senate to install these unqualified extremists. Where do you find these people? Courts have ruled that both Ms. Habba and Ms. Chattah are serving in their roles illegally, jeopardizing countless prosecutions by your office. Why? And that's just one example of how the Department of Justice is making America less safe. Attorney General Bondi shut down the Organized Crime and Drug Enforcement Task Force, OSADEF, which has dismantled thousands of criminal organizations. And you diverted thousands of FBI, DEA, and ATF agents and DOJ prosecutors from their critical missions to carry out the president's mass deportation agenda. Attorney General Bondi, not surprisingly, federal drug prosecutions have dropped to the lowest level in decades. Let me repeat that. Federal prosecutions for drug crimes have dropped to the lowest level in decades on your watch. The Department of Justice has also unilaterally terminated 373 grants that provide critical funding to state and local law enforcement to the tune of $500 million. The 2026 Trump budget would slash the high-intensity drug trafficking areas program known as HIDA by more than a third, from $300 million to $196 million. Instead of taking common-sense steps that have proven to help reduce crime, Attorney General, you're focusing on helping President Trump play strongman on television. He has illegally deployed troops to Chicago and other American cities and has threatened to send more. The Justice Department defends this dubious legal basis for these deployments and diverts DOJ personnel and their components to assist in these efforts. These deployments basically target Democratic-run cities and Democratic leaders, ignoring many Republican-led areas of our country with even higher crime rates, and making clear that this is for political theater, not public safety. One particular chaotic raid in Chicago Tuesday last week, aided by the FBI and ATF, which you supervise. In the middle of the night, federal agents pulled women and children out of their beds, crashed down the doors to their homes, destroyed their apartments, zip-tied children and others, and detained immigrants and U.S. citizens alike for hours in vans. When one witness complained about the treatment of the small children, an agent laughed at her and said, "F them kids." On Friday, a federal judge appointed by President Trump held that deploying the National Guard in Portland is illegal. White House Deputy Chief of Staff Stephen Miller accused her of, quote, legal insurrection, close quote. At a time of rising threats to federal judges, this kind of language is inexcusable. Last week, the President and Secretary Hegseth summoned senior military officials to a political pep rally at Quantico, where the President said he wanted to use American cities as, quote, training grounds for our military. Training grounds for our military. To fight the, quote, enemy within. Chicago is not the enemy. Our fellow Americans are not the enemy. It is abhorrent for the President, who is supposed to represent all Americans regardless of political party, to describe anyone who disagrees with him in this manner. To my Republican colleagues who claim the previous administration weaponized the Department of Justice, President Biden retained President Trump's FBI Director Christopher Wray, who President Trump then fired. President Biden never directed the Attorney General to prosecute his political opponents. President Biden never fired his own political appointees for refusing to prosecute his targets. What has taken place since January 20th, 2025 would make even President Nixon recoil. This is your legacy, Attorney General Bondi. In 8 short months, you have fundamentally transformed the Justice Department and left an enormous stain in American history. It will take decades to recover.
You know, sometimes when you watch an oversight hearing, it feels like another Washington ritual. A little political theater, some finger pointing, and everyone goes home. But this one felt different. The tone, the accusations, the scale of what was alleged, it all carried the weight of something much deeper, something that cuts into the heart of what the Justice Department is supposed to be. The senator's remarks were blistering, a full-throated charge that the Attorney General has turned the Justice Department into a political weapon, a shield for friends and a sword for opponents. And whether you agree or not, the gravity of that accusation is enormous. Because if the department tasked with upholding the law bends it for politics, then the entire foundation of equal justice begins to shake. Now, let's take a step back. Attorney General Bondi's supporters would tell you she's cleaning house, getting rid of entrenched bureaucrats, reforming agencies that had grown too political, focusing on national priorities like border enforcement and public safety. They'd say the department was long overdue for an overhaul and that what critics call purges are really just course corrections. But the critics paint a darker picture, one where seasoned officials with decades of law enforcement experience are replaced by political loyalists, where task forces on foreign interference and corruption are quietly dismantled, where prosecutors who once chased organized crime are told to focus instead on television optics and immigration raids. If you listen carefully, what's being described isn't just mismanagement, it's the hollowing out of a democratic institution. The senator accuses Bondi of firing hundreds of career officials, disbanding the FBI's Foreign Influence Task Force, and cutting the Public Integrity Section down to almost nothing. That's the unit responsible for prosecuting political corruption. Think about that. Political corruption cases, deprioritized, while political allies are allegedly shielded. And it's not just about personnel, it's about principle. When the department's internal ethics officers are replaced by political appointees, when oversight bodies like the Office of Professional Responsibility go silent, it doesn't just look bad, it invites distrust. The claim that the Attorney General, once a registered foreign agent, failed to recuse herself from decisions involving foreign gifts to the president, that's not a small detail. That's the kind of ethical breach that, if true, would have sparked bipartisan outrage in any previous era. Now, defenders might argue these are exaggerated partisan talking points. They'll remind us that the Justice Department, under any administration, is vast and messy, and that every attorney general brings their own priorities. And sure, it's true that political leaders shape policy, but there's a line between shaping policy and subverting justice. Let's look at the record the senator laid out. The dropping of prosecutions after defendants hired the attorney general's brother, loyalty-based appointments of prosecutors, even reinstating figures accused of serious misconduct. If accurate, those aren't reforms, they're rewards for loyalty, and loyalty to a person should never trump loyalty to the Constitution. One of the most troubling claims came later in that testimony, the story of federal agents in Chicago conducting chaotic nighttime raids, tearing families from their homes and zip-tying children. Now, federal law enforcement has a hard job. Mistakes happen. But if these accounts are even partially true, they raise deep questions about how justice is being enforced and who it's meant to serve. Because when the law becomes a show of force, it stops being law. It becomes spectacle. President Trump's defenders will tell you this is all media spin, that Chicago was overrun with violence and needed tough action. But look closer. Those deployments targeted mostly Democratic-led cities. Republican-led areas with higher crime rates saw nothing similar. That's not a law and order strategy, that's politics in uniform. On Morning Joe, we've often said institutions matter more than individuals. The Justice Department isn't supposed to serve a president's political goals. It's supposed to serve the law. And when you start seeing selective enforcement, pardons that appear to cover unrelated crimes, prosecutions against political opponents but not allies, the alarms go off. It's not about party anymore. It's about precedent. Because once one administration does it, the next one can too. And here's where it gets dangerous. The senator pointed out that after January 6th, more than 1,600 individuals were pardoned, including hundreds who attacked police officers. The department's argument that those pardons could grant immunity in unrelated cases, that's an extraordinary interpretation of executive power. It effectively says, if you have the right friends, the law bends around you. You don't have to be a Democrat or Republican to see the problem. You just have to believe in the rule of law, because justice can't work on a sliding scale. Either the law applies to everyone, or it doesn't apply at all. Now, let's be fair. Every administration faces accusations of politicizing justice. Democrats said it about Trump, Republicans said it about Biden. But the scale of this, the sheer number of firings, the dismantling of investigative units, the open favoritism alleged here, is unlike anything we've seen in decades. The senator even compared it to Watergate, saying President Nixon would recoil. Hyperbole maybe, but it speaks to a fear that something fundamental is being lost. And that's what this hearing was really about. Not just oversight, but accountability. If the Justice Department becomes a political arm, democracy itself weakens. When citizens no longer trust that the courts and prosecutors are independent, everything else falls apart. Elections, public safety, even national unity. So where does that leave us? On one hand, we have a government saying it's fighting corruption and restoring order. On the other, we have mounting evidence, or at least allegations, that it's doing the opposite. The truth will depend on what investigations uncover, but one thing's certain, transparency has to return. Because when oversight hearings are dismissed as partisan noise, corruption thrives in the shadows. The American people deserve a Justice Department that stands for law, not loyalty. They deserve to know that prosecutions aren't political favors and pardons aren't personal gifts. Chicago is not the enemy. Neither is Portland, New York, or any other American city. The enemy is cynicism, the creeping belief that the system is rigged beyond repair. Once people stop believing justice is blind, the republic loses its backbone. So yes, hearings like this one are messy, they're angry, they're uncomfortable, but they're also necessary. Because if we stop asking who's right and who's wrong, if we stop demanding the truth, we'll lose the very thing that makes this country different: accountability. At the end of the day, the senator's words are a warning, and the attorney general's defense, whatever it may be, deserves to be heard. But somewhere between outrage and justification lies a simple truth. Justice must never serve politics. Not in 2025, not ever. And that's the real test of leadership. Whether you can hold power without abusing it, and whether the institutions built to protect democracy can survive the people who try to bend them. That's where we are, and that's why this moment matters.